Témoigner.
Bearing witness. What does this expression mean in this day and age? What should we bear witness about? By what means? For what purpose? And to whom does this witness account go to? Bearing witness to render visible, to allow a phenomenon to exist, bearing witness to account for another reality, bearing witness to keep a trace, a memory, proof, bearing witness lest we forget, bearing witness to sound the alarm and push to action, bearing witness simply to tell a story, or bearing witness to call out. But also, who bears witness? Whoever has had first-hand experience or whoever is passing on the baton? And what should we do with this testimony? What does it activate in the person receiving it? Does it simply become a piece of information, an invitation, a call, a responsibility, a burden, a real experience in and of itself? In times of environmental crisis, bearing witness also means making tangible, concrete, and perceivable global phenomena that are all too often abstract, difficult to represent, disconnected, objectifying, technical, latent, hidden. Writers then play as much the role of investigator as that of a sensory prosthesis, enabling us to better define and access reality. We've all heard a lot about water-related issues, from droughts, heat waves, floods, to problems of access to drinking water, pollution, melting glaciers, rising sea levels. But have you ever experienced these phenomena yourself? Have you had first-hand experience of them yourself? What do we really know about the causes and the consequences of these phenomena? Who do they affect? Where do they happen? What do they herald in? How can we account a story about these places that are dying? How can we continue to inhabit worlds that are intrinsically disrupted? With my guests this evening, Alison Armstrong and Cédric Gras, we invite you to navigate the dense, little-known waters of the Aral Sea and the great rivers of Central Asia, all the way to those of North Sea off the Yorkshire coast, for geopolitical and poetic exploration of water, thus capturing the ambivalent textures of what is at stake in these territories, where the most important resource of all is both the victim and the executioner, because it has become so scarce in one place and too abundant in another place. It's as devastating as it is dependent. What can we take away from these intersecting stories by reweaving close ties that bond human relationship with their natural environment? And to enlighten our conversation and give even more body and texture to this issue, we propose to start our evening with a screening of 2 short films, each about 15 minutes long, that deal directly with the territories in question. First, Beyond the Glacier, Notes on Water Conflicts, by Spanish director David Rodriguez Muniz, released in 2019. This documentary has received several awards. It takes us to Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, where one of Central Asia's major water conflicts is being played out. Through the stories of those who make a living from the water, the film analyzes the trajectory and the complex history of the various uses of the Surdarya River from its source in the glaciers of the Tian Shan mountain range to its mouth in the unfortunate Aral Sea. This will be followed by a second documentary, East Yorkshire Coastline, by Lawrence Querner, which immerses us in the desolate post-apocalyptic landscapes of England's East Yorkshire coast. It gives us a chance to see and hear about the ongoing erosion caused by the rising level of the North Sea and its impact on the land, the people who live there, and the local wildlife. We'll see each other again after the screening. See you in a bit.
The supply countries in Central Asia being Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, where the glaciers are. The states that demand the water, of course, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan. Now, when all of these locations were all in the same country, water was not crossing international boundaries. We were all within one internationally recognized state. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, we have this fairly complicated international boundary situation. It just sort of really raises the specter of conflict over water.
В Кыргызстане уже из карты исчезло более 2000 ледников, малых ледников. И уменьшается этот состав ледника. И разрабатывать под ледником же этот месторождение Кумтор. Золото добывать под ледником. И этого ледника уже убирает, и вместо него вот это.
Там ледник Петрова находится выше этого рудника Кумтор. Но там есть ледник, несколько ледников, они при взрывах, вот, возможно, осаждение вот этой пыли, взрывной пыли, и там может интенсивное таяние происходить. Ну это охраняемая территория, поэтому там меры охраны, меры секретности. Мы даже, вот, граждане Кыргызстана, не имеем права туда заезжать без особой необходимости. Если у нас есть командировочный, мы заезжаем.
Акта 32-ге vurdu da. Tamam. Arada mu prova yazdı, dinamik tüketken. Tüketken de casallara değil mi? Teşekkür ederim.
Наша компания в Кыргызстане, естественно, является самым большим предприятием, которое производит золото. И не только в Кыргызстане. Кумтор является одним из больших крупных месторождений в мире. Кумтора в год составляет в районе 6,3 миллиона тонн руды. То есть, можно сказать, в первую двадцатку она входит.
сколько перерода, потому что запрещено было тияқтан алыстан келишет. А это алтын деген, алтын деген.
Разрешать, да, это,
Жаны жоқ.
Потом не разрешать. Просто рыбачим, браконьерство. Конечно, қыштың күні погода начар онда переживает. Балық сатсаң ақшаң болса нормальный. Қомақты кәне. Үйге түсіп аласың кіші. Таптың ба? Эй! Оңға. Да, пошли.
Связи нету, да?
Есть. Бар.
Не
Связь
всегда.
есть. Вот телефон есть. Ошка и Билайн тасат.
Когда
Связи?
ветер, тогда нету связи.
Ну вы созваниваетесь, да?
Есть,
иногда?
Сообщаемся.
Хорошо.
Ну а что делать-то?
Ну да, это жизнь.
Жизнь. Надо же кормиться, надо же.
Да.
Бағыш керек.
Да.
Бақпасаң, они переживают, үйде отырышат, күтіп.
О, вот 1 штук. 1 штук. Педят. Фишмен.
Останется рыба, не останется, будет еще такая зима или будет теплее.
Бог покажет.
God knows.
Будет рыба.
Бог дает, еще дальше даст.
Аральское море – одно из величайших озер мира. Оно в 2 раза больше Байкала. Его длина 428, а ширина 284 километра. Аральский порт – ворота моря. Отсюда по воде идут самые различные грузы в республике Средней Азии. И хотя у причалов порта не швартуются иностранные суда, здесь всегда оживленно. Первый пароход на Аральском море появился более 100 лет назад. Его привезли в разобранном виде на верблюдах. Теперь воды Древнего моря бороздят сотни больших и малых судов.
In the 70s, this place used to be once the sea, and now we are standing on the former seabed. First time I came to the sea, I was only 17 years old, because before I heard from my parents that the sea exists once more. And this line of hills behind me, it used to be the coastline before the 70s. So all the way up to the hills, it was water. In the 70s, Soviet Union, they decided to use the water from Sirdarya and the Amudarya rivers, and these were the two rivers feeding the Aral Sea. And the water started to use for irrigation of the cotton fields in Uzbekistan. So there was less water feeding the Aral Sea. So in the mid-70s, it started to shrink, and in '89, it was divided into two parts, big and the small Aral Sea. In the 60s, before the shrinking of the Aral Sea, the annual catch from the sea was about 21,000 tons of fish per year. And then after shrinking, the fishing had stopped, and all the fishermen, they had to leave their villages, move to the big cities because of unemployment. But now it's sad, but now there is a hope that the sea is coming back, because there are 14 villages around the North Aral Sea, and the fishing is the main source of income for the people living in the villages, because there is no other job. They live only on fishing.
Water exists in three different states. We have obviously solid, liquid, and gas. So we have water in the atmosphere, locked up in the glaciers, and of course in the rivers. Water shortages, I do agree, in the future are going to be increasingly pressing problems for the world. This idea of water wars, to me, is rather frightening. Do I think it's possible? Unfortunately, yes. And that is a fairly frightening proposition.
So Bempton is a really magical place. The cliff tops are absolutely huge, and at this time of year it's pretty quiet out there, but we're starting to get into spring, and then we'll have lots of seabirds kind of returning, the noise will grow, the smell will change. It's a really exciting time of year for us here. So in the spring and summer, that soundscape out there on the cliff tops completely changes. It's really loud, noisy, full of a whole variety of seabirds, and a little bit smelly sometimes too, but I do quite like that. We have all of our puffins, our gannets, our guillemots, razorbills, all kind of feeding into that wonderful soundscape of the cliffs. And as those birds kind of start to leave later on in the breeding season, the sound completely changes, and it's mostly just kind of gannets out on the cliffs. We have nearly 500,000 seabirds here at the height of the season, and it is just an absolutely magical place during that time.
10 to 15 years, yeah, it's got a lot worse. As the currents have moved around, with the erosion and everything, yeah, it keeps washing away. Every good storm, it's gone. A bit more's gone, and you can't. Well, it used to be inhabitable. I think there was houses a couple of. I mean, when we used to go when we was younger, all the buildings was there from what the army was when World War II was on, what they built up, and you could go in and out of them when you all had doors on. And Spain was like a proper spit of land, what you could wander about on, and the lighthouse was there, and all the Humber pilots was there. And as it's worn away, everything's just disappearing and gone, and it's washed away in every storm. It's the mud, isn't it? Because it's all been brought down, as I've been told, basically. So it's not compacted hard enough, so it's just being washed away and we're losing it over time. But yeah.
Bonsoir, je suis Fanny Wobman et je suis résidente ici en même temps que mes collègues. Et je vais vous lire un extrait du texte de Cédric Gras. La route longe le désert, rogné par le sable. On a peine à croire que dans quelques minutes apparaîtra un fleuve derrière les dunes. C'est la 20e fois depuis notre départ que nous allons revoir l'Amou Daria. Nous sommes chaque fois heureux de retrouver ces méandres. À quoi ressemble-t-il dans ces parages? Comment se porte-t-il? Nous faisons notre possible pour le suivre à travers les steppes desséchées, les autocraties et les imbroglios de frontières. Nous savons ce qu'il souffre et nous l'avons vu mourir au fin fond du Karakalpakstan comme un vieil éléphant. En Nouvelle-Zélande, un peuple a récemment fait reconnaître la rivière de ses ancêtres comme une entité vivante. En Inde, le Parlement vient d'accorder le même statut au Gange. S'il était personnifié par une juridiction, Dieu sait si l'Amu Darya aurait de quoi se plaindre. Il pourrait faire condamner l'Eurasie tout entière. Mais si les peuples vouaient à l'Amu Darya un culte en des temps anciens, aucune divinité des eaux n'est plus vénérée de nos jours. Le fleuve ne s'inscrit désormais dans aucune cosmologie, aucun panthéon. J'ignore pour ma part si l'Amu Darya est vivant, à l'image d'un être, d'un arbre ou d'un papillon. Mais ce dont je suis certain, c'est qu'il donne la vie sous les longitudes les plus insupportables. À Termèse, nous sommes d'autant plus émus de le revoir qu'il y est ample et puissant. Son cours remplit pleinement le lit et tous les flots du Pamir glissent entre les rives arides. Ce n'est plus, ou pas encore, ce fleuve malade que nous avons vu en aval, à Turkmenabat, à Riva ou Noukous. Nous le contemplons ici à son comble, fort de tous ses affluents et pas encore saigné par les canaux d'irrigation, les champs de coton ou les cités en pleine expansion. C'est un fleuve originel, presque sauvage, qui coule sous nos yeux. L'Amu Darya, dit Christophe, le vrai, tel que le contempla Alexandre le Grand quand il traversa ici avec son armée. L'Oxus des Grecs, des Perses, des Moghols, des rois couchants, des conquérants arabes, des fumeurs de hache et des trafiquants d'opium.
Bonsoir. C'est un... Is it working?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. C'est un plaisir d'être
Maybe
ici.
more close to your mouth, maybe. Yeah. Perfect.
Je suis désolée de ne pas parler français ce soir.
Able to speak French tonight.
Exist only on a horizontal plane, this landscape. The gaze cannot help but be drawn across its surface like a smoothing hand, snagged by anything poking above the flatness. It was formed in the wake of disappearing glaciers that carried and dumped the clay and debris that constitutes much of the area. What we now know as East Yorkshire was mostly given over to bog and swamp, fed with rain and spring water finding its way across chalk from the wolds. Extensive wetlands had been seen as valueless wastelands until conservationists taught us to look again, see their importance not only for biodiversity and preservation of species, but in their potential for carbon sequestration and as a buffer in flood control. Daniel Defoe wrote in the 1720s when he visited the Humber wetlands, "The most that I can find remarkable here is that nothing is remarkable." It was drained towards the end of the 18th century by a series of dikes, large drainage channels and sluices. The fertile clay is given over to agriculture so that now it is field after field of cereal and seed oil crops. The huge whaling industry ambitions of the nearby port of Hull were replaced by those for seed oils, as Hull became the world centre for seed oil manufacture. We are culturally inclined to value the dramatic summits and contrast in a landscape, so that here it seems almost featureless, and the overwhelming feeling is dullness, ambivalence. As you walk through it, it invites you in, this unremarkableness, to look for things. The eye is drawn along the contours of fields, odd shapes of boundary lines, irregularities of surface forms. There are traces of prehistoric enclosures, extensive rough pastures, and smaller cultivated areas. Ditches or raised banks of earth show the lines marking a field, appearing within the boundary of another, more modern field. Some continuation of a desire in human consciousness to make physical boundaries around a space, to mark it off in function or ownership. In some places, burial mounds have been enclosed too, marked in the earth and with the surrounding rings of stone, suggestive of protection or ritual. The area is a palimpsest of meanings. Different points in time seem to coexist here. Different ways of seeing and being in a place, not only human, but animal and plant too. They hold a mirror up to how we view the land, relationships and connections within it, how we view ourselves, defying ideas of progress, linear narratives. Earth is constantly moving, revealing itself as it surfaces. The landscape holds memory, testimony, and as it falls away at the edges, throws up its past, fossils, prehistoric ossuaries, unexploded ordnance, and pillboxes from the Second World War, landfill from caravan parks, dumped industrial waste, homes, churches, more recent burial grounds, offering itself up to new layers of interpretation. There is a sense that in giving up of its past, the land itself remembers, wants to be seen briefly as it topples over the edge to join the wrecks of towns, villages, submerged forests lying beneath the sea. On the cliff tops, the scent of dog rose lingers, plantains grow miniaturized on the walked bare path. Closer to the edge, the threat of erosion keeps people away. A short-lived no man's land where vegetation flourishes, tumble-down habitats for a bewildering variety of invertebrates and colonizing plants. Lesser burdock, south thistle, common knapweed, red campion, and the statuesque teasels with their spiked conical flower heads defying the wind, their small purple petals sprouting in rings. Wispy halos cling close and are alive in the sun with a haze and drift of golden flies.
Alors, Cédric et Alison, bonsoir.
Cedric and Alison, good evening. Thank you very much for being here for this third nature writing conversation of the cycle L'écriture des lieux at the Foundation Jan Michalski on the role of the writer as a witness of current social and environmental challenges represented here by landscapes in conflict or that are being destroyed in relation to water. A first question maybe for you. I will ask you to introduce yourself, but what does it mean for you, bearing witness? Who would like to start?
Bonsoir.
Good evening. Bearing witness. I never started working thinking I would bear witness. I started selfishly to understand for myself. And once you have understood a few things, then you start wanting to convey messages. It's a gradual process. One shouldn't think that when you start writing that you know the structure, the title, the release date. For Central Asia, for instance, I started working in 2020. And back then, I did not think that this would become a literary project. I just went to see what was happening. And you, Alison, bearing witness, what does this mean to you?
I think it just means quietly observing and seeing what's around, and also connecting with other writers and other observers of the natural environment in particular. Naming things and being aware of other names and the connectedness of species and place in a landscape. Yeah, the different meanings that are held there.
Being integrated in a territory. So maybe could you briefly introduce yourself for those who do not know you tonight? How would you introduce yourself to our audience, Cédric? Or Alison, since you have the microphone?
So I'm a writer from the north of England. I work mainly in fiction and writing a novel and short stories and plays. And I'm interested in voices that are not ordinarily heard. So the voices of nature and people at the margins. And yeah, that's about it. Yeah. I just started in the last few years working on a non-fiction project, which is why I'm here tonight.
I've been with Alison for 3 weeks and now I exactly know what she's doing. My English is really poor, so it's good to get to know her. What do I do? So I write, and I write in all forms with all media. I am a journalist. I also started writing for a documentary. I even wrote film script. I also tried different genres, novels, but also travel novels, literature of reality, so to speak. So that's what I like to do. And the topic of tonight will also be this literature of reality. You are both resident writers to write your future works, excerpts of which we just heard. Thank you very much for that. Alison, you are finishing your project entitled Diminishing, if I pronounce it well, and Cédric, you also said that you are finishing your project entitled La Route de la Soif, the Road of Thirst. So this is something that we will expand on throughout the evening, but could you maybe pitch your project? Tell us about your projects. Those are not published works yet. They haven't been presented yet. So how could you introduce this project as well as your process? What was interesting for you in those investigations on water scarcity in Central Asia, on the other side, on the erosion in the Yorkshire? So just a few words about the project and then your process. What led you to be interested in this issue in particular?
Okay, so I was interested in the East Yorkshire coast because I spent my adolescence there, and at 18 I couldn't wait to leave the place, but I've kind of like been drawn back to it in the last few years, and it seemed to kind of embody a lot of things that were happening in the wider environment and wider world. And it seemed a metaphor for loss because I'm interested in like depletion of bird species and nature and habitats. And that seemed to kind of like encapsulate it because those things sometimes seem a little bit vague and sometimes a little bit hard to grasp. Statistics sometimes seem a little bit empty and meaningless. They go up and they go down, and they don't necessarily seem to be tied to any particular trajectory. So it's difficult to get a hold on what's happening. And the East Yorkshire coast, because it was dramatically collapsing into the sea, the rate of collapse has kind of like increased with climate change. It's gone from like roughly losing about 2 meters a year to losing about 10. And that dramatic collapse seemed to kind of like be a metaphor of that loss. And it was a way to kind of explore those ideas on what was happening on a bigger scale.
Merci.
Thank you very much. What about you, Cédric? A few words about your project. What led you to be interested in this topic? The first time I traveled there, it wasn't to work on the Aral Sea. I don't like deserts. I'm hot. I think it's very dull. And I did not want to go to the Aral Sea. I went there for mountaineering in the Tajikistan mountain called the Palmyre because I spotted one glacier called the Fishenko Glacier. And back then I was working on another project on the Soviet mountaineers. It was a completely different project. But when I arrived in this glacier and looking at the flows and how it turned into a river, I realized that it was one of the main sources for the Aral Sea. So I became intrigued. I studied geography, so this is a topic that I am familiar with, and the Aral Sea is a textbook case. When I was at university, we heard a lot about the Aral Sea. And so I thought, maybe there's something to do there. We talk a lot about the drying out of the Aral Sea, but I never really heard too much about the sources. Although it's important to know where the water is coming from, and we know why it's not coming to the Aral Sea. It's about irrigation and cotton fields. But as to the glaciers, I didn't know much about it. And back then we were making films from the Arte TV channel, and so I wanted to go up the Sirdarya. There was another film on this river and on the Amu Darya. And so my aim was not to write a book. So we filmed those two documentaries, and I thought this is interesting. Filming twice was already a long time, 3 months, and so the trigger was that one country refused our entry. It was in Turkmenistan. It's a North Korean-like dictatorship, but it is one of the countries which, for many reasons, is causing the drying out of the Aral Sea. And so I thought, let's go. Let's try and go there without any cameras. And so we will try to investigate on this and write a book, also using all the information I gathered over time. So those are travel stories, investigations. Yes, I'm telling this in the form of stories, in the form of investigations, and it's complicated to work in those areas. Turkmenistan is a dictatorship. Just to enter the country, it was quite difficult. I even ended up being arrested. But in Uzbekistan, things tend to go well. They don't like us paying too much attention to those topics. Now there's also Afghanistan, which is creating a huge channel upstream. This creates a lot of chaos in Central Asia. Those are very delicate topics. There are entire regions, countries that depend on the river. So this is an investigation, but I'm trying to tell this story in an entertaining way, but also with a teaching purpose, because those are regions that are not very well known to Westerners. Hydrography is not a topic that we learn a lot at school about, so I'm trying to make the information easier to digest. We will come back to the teaching dimension of this, but what's also interesting in your approach, and which is this idea of investigation, it shows the way telling about travels has evolved. You also said that it was very difficult for you to travel to those regions, that you didn't like it, that there was something that was more intellectual than emotional. And Alison, earlier you said that you had wanted to leave those places when you were younger, and that it was, the countryside was dull and boring for you, and still you came back. And so we can see that what's at stake is not so much emotional as it might have been the case formerly. So is this the future of this genre, do you think? Alison, if you could make sure that you hold the mic closer to your mouth. Thank you.
I'm not sure that I can speak of what the future of that genre would be, but I'd like to see it being more inclusive of different voices, and which it is being. There are lots of different voices, and looking at different places also. Yeah, and yeah. It's that kind of thing. And also, yeah.
But there's the part between the experience of traveling and the intellectual motivation. Is this something that you felt in your investigation? in the idea that you wanted to account for what was happening?
It was because I wanted to find a prism to see a lot of different things, and really at first look at the place, it's quite boring, the landscape is boring, there's not a lot going on, but actually spending time in there and talking to people and hearing their stories, a lot of the places are a prism for things that are going on more generally. There's 3 very important sites for bird conservation. They're on the East Atlantic Flyway, bird superhighway, and they're all involved in restoring habitats for to preserve species and provide extensive and extended habitats for those species. Yeah, and I think to engage in what people are doing on the ground is a really interesting space, I think, because there are an awful lot of people working in conservation, and they're just asking for so little, really, and to kind of like write about them and engage with them and expand their ideas and demands is really, really interesting for me.
Can you say a few words on this notion? You said that traveling was complicated. Yes, I said so a while ago. Deserts I don't find very interesting. I was once asked to accompany a group to the Sahara. I'd never been there. And I really don't understand why people go there, walk in the desert. It's more than 40 degrees. You have to look for a tree to have lunch and have a break in the shade. And the trees have leaves that are so small that it's really hard to find. And then you go on and walk again. So really, deserts are not my thing. Maybe if they were cold, I don't know. So my motivation was rather intellectual. I wanted to understand where this water ran off, where it disappeared. And I was also fascinated. I'm still fascinated. Central Asian civilization were all built on the management of these rivers. So we spoke a lot about industrial level irrigation under the Soviet regime that dried up the Aral Sea. But if you look at ancient Greece, cotton was already being grown 2,000 years ago, and this cotton was transported along the Silk Road. So it's age-old, and Central Asia would never have developed, it would never have experienced these fascinating civilizations if it hadn't been for the glaciers in the Pamir, whose runoff fertilizes the plain. It hardly ever rains in Central Asia. It rains in the mountains, the water turns into snow, it's stocked as ice, and this runs off during the summer. But without the Pamir glaciers, these civilizations would never have flourished. And it's something that really fascinated me. And downstream, these are the heirs of these empires. People have to leave their villages and maybe go to bigger-sized cities. I just wanted to come back to the role played by writers. You said that there were tensions, you were arrested. I didn't go to prison, but I was arrested. I was prevented to continue my investigation at one point. Well, so what was the role of your work as a writer vis-a-vis the populations, the authorities? You mentioned this a while ago. When you bear witness, you investigate. There's all the literary work that you do. So what's the role of the artist and how is it perceived? Well, in the former Soviet Union, Journalist is a four-letter word. If you say you're a poet, you might stand a chance. But if you introduce yourself as a journalist, no way. So it's really a double-edged sword. You should never say that you're a journalist. Now, they're far from being stupid. All it takes is for you to Google your name. That's exactly what happened to me in Turkmenistan. I had to find another solution. I had to ask for help from people I knew in the country, but they hate when you start looking into this. Turkmenistan is a dictatorship. It's a Soviet-style dictatorship. They just don't want you to snoop and look into this. Water problems? There are no water problems here. So there's just there's no issue, so there's nothing to talk about. Uzbekistan is slightly different. It's opened up very slightly since the death of Karimov, the former president. The new president is not quite the Democrat, but things have opened up, and they're so concerned by these issues. I mean, you see, but people see when the river hardly has any water left. So the press has covered this. You go to Tajikistan, they don't care. They've got dams, they've got the glaciers, so each country is quite different. Now, the role of the writer in all of this, I don't say that I'm going to write a book, because that's that's a recipe for trouble. Now, if you've got a camera, you just say you're there to shoot beautiful footage. You ask very limited questions, but it doesn't prevent you from looking elsewhere at what's happening. Uzbekistan is trying to open up and is trying to change its reputation to that of an open country. So I don't really have a given technique. In Turkmenistan, I think they saw the notebook I had in my pocket. I use it to take notes. That's what got me into trouble. If you go to other countries, China, or elsewhere, you tend to be followed. Technologies such as AI make it possible to follow you in a very modern way. Now, in Turkmenistan, and I was told the exact same thing in China, you're shadowed in the street the old way, just to put mental pressure on you. If you're only followed digitally, you don't realize this. So they're trying to pressure you with conventional, traditional methods, which have nothing to do with intelligence gathering anymore. And I think that's what happened to me in Turkmenistan. They saw me take notes in my notebook, and that's what probably set alarm bells ringing. They knew exactly who I was when I entered the country, but I had the support of the French embassy, and they had to say yes. And when I started traveling around the country, they said, let's stop. What about you, Alison? What's the reaction amongst the population to the investigation you've carried out? How is your work perceived by the population? How do you integrate in this landscape?
People are more than willing to talk. I don't have as high-tech cameras and things filming along with me. So I'm just there with my notebook, and yeah, in some places they feel kind of quite neglected by the government and the land protection that's going on, because certain points along the coastline are protected by embankments and boulders and groins built across to try and revetments to try and stop the water, the sea taking the coastline, which is mud and vulnerable to erosion. So, but in other places, there's been no such fortifications to protect the coastline, and there's kind of like resentment among the people there. They feel abandoned and not really listened to, and that their plight is not interesting to anybody. And the effect, actually, of protecting part of the coastline is that the sea comes with extra force to the parts that are not protected. So it's like, it's almost like it's kind of structured to kind of like aggravate them. And yeah, so in those places, people are not that willing to talk. They want to know why you want to know. And there was just before I was in a particular place called Skipton, which is eroding very quickly. There'd just been a big kind of like media thing, The Guardian and The Observer going there and interviewing people, and people felt like it was their chance to kind of like put themselves on the spotlight, and then it all died away, of course, because nobody was really interested long term, and they got very cagey about speaking to people, and also because their houses were actually falling into the sea, and they were under an obligation to pull them down, get rid of a lot of the material inside, so they were not happy.
Pour bien comprendre ce qui se passe du coup.
To understand what's happening over there and in your books, can you tell us a little bit about the consequences, about what's at stake? It's something that you've mentioned very briefly. What are the consequences? Are those the consequences of global warming? Is that what's happening with the rising level of the North Sea? Is that something that you could take up very briefly, and then maybe tell us a little bit about something that really affected you during your investigation in relation to this issue?
It's definitely, I mean, the erosion has always been happening since it was formed 10,000 years ago, because it's formed of clay and moraine that's been brought down by the glacier. It's fragile, but because of the increase in rain and increase in storms and rising sea levels, it's been exaggerated, and the rate of erosion has increased in some places almost 5 times, 6 times, 7 times what it used to be. It's difficult, actually, when you talk about bearing witness, it's difficult to know exactly how much, because it's not measured continually, although in some places they have started to measure it, and they've been quite shocked at the rates of loss. So yeah, it's definitely increasing because of climate change. It's very hard to say how and what will be the long-term consequences, how fast it will, start to move in the future.
I heard that it was about 10 meters of land taken by erosion every year, right? Is there a specific phenomenon that struck you during your investigation that you'd like to talk about?
Yeah, there is a phenomenon, and it's just been written about by oceanographers, and it's where, because beneath the sand is clay also, so that's also quite vulnerable, and the sand gets washed away, and there's like depressions created by the movement of the waves, and these cause extra, they're called ords, and they cause extra kind of like movement of the water attacking the land. It increases the force, and although there's a kind of average of like 10 meters in places, it can sometimes be up to 20, 30 meters. In particularly heavy storms. There was one in 2013. Took a lot of land. It was quite shocking. People.
Cedric, turning towards you. The stakes are not quite the same. Global warming is not directly is not the direct culprit. Can you tell us a little more about it? Well, global warming, I guess, is coming. It's the next step, but the situation is already catastrophic. For the past 50 years, there's been excessive consumption of water, excessive irrigation of crops, including cotton, but there's also lots of rice that is being grown in the desert in Central Asia, which is absolutely nonsensical. There are also melons, watermelons, lots of agriculture going on, lots of farming. And these countries, as they developed, had to divert the water from the river. So there's excessive consumption. And in addition to this comes global warming. Now, global warming means higher temperatures in the plain and melting of glaciers. There are thousands of glaciers in the Pamir and the Hindu Kush, which is in the water basin of the Mudarya, in Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan. These glaciers are colossal. The Vichenko Glacier, if you just look at the bottom part of it, just at the bottom part of it, it's 77 kilometers long. I don't remember what the Aletsch Glacier is in Switzerland. I don't remember the size of the Mer de Glace in France. But it's more or less equivalent to the whole volume of glaciers in the Alps. And that's one single glacier. So it's absolutely colossal. But it's melting. And for downstream countries, it's quite deceiving because it means more water at first. And this is something that they have to anticipate because 15, 20 years from now, they'll get to a level where there will no longer be any glaciers to melt. So that's the second step for them. They're preparing for this. I'm not saying that they're not doing anything. There's a lot being invested to renovate channels. There's also the river, of course, but that's not a problem for the river. Does not have the same problem as the channels. They're investing. I don't know whether it'll be enough to compensate. In parallel, there's a population explosion in some of these countries. Of course, we would like to have less cotton grown, but the problem is that it means a lot of money for these countries. It brings in lots more money than growing vegetables, for instance. It's something that I find very striking.
Il y a malgré du beau, non? Dans ces territoires en ruine.
In those desolate landscapes, were you able to experience this? Could you say that there is something beautiful about it? Is there something beautiful that remains? Honestly, the dried up Aral Sea and it's the shrinking river is very sad. Maybe there's some beauty in the apocalypse, but it's quite sad. One of the fishermen that we met had tears in his eyes when he spoke to us because when he was a child, he said we couldn't see the other bank. We went to a fisherman's village in the Amu Darya River that was famous for its fish restaurants. People loved to come over the weekend to eat fish. And it was towards the end of summer. It was a period where there was the rivers were at the lowest levels. But they were still serving fish. But he was saying there's no fish anymore. You can cross the river. There is fish, but it comes from a farming basin. But they wanted to keep the tradition of the village, so they started growing fish with water coming from pipes. So this is very sad. So there is, of course, some beauty about the desert. Now, desolate landscapes, yes, maybe landscapes are desolate, and there was some degree of desolation, ruin after the Soviet Union. But those are countries that are building themselves back, and there are also gas resources that arrived also in Turkmenistan. the capital has changed, so it's not as simple. I'd like to talk about the relationship of those populations with natural elements, especially water. There are Aras Parsi tribes in Central Asia, in England, descendants of the Saxons and the Vikings. Listening to your extract, Cédric, you were talking about the Amu Darya in the third person, saying that it's suffering, that it's ill. You also said that the river is part of it's no longer part of any cosmology or pantheon. What does this mean? Back then, the river was sacred. If you're in a desert when it never rains and when life only comes from the river, you use the water to drink and to water your crops, it makes sense to start blessing the river. And that's what happened. There are many testimonies related to Zarathustra with many sacrifices in the spring when there was a flood. A bit like in Egypt, we can compare the Amu Darya to the Nile or to Mesopotamia in the role that it played. And of course, there was a time when the river had a certain part in the world representation of populations in Central Asia. This is no longer the case now. It was converted to Islam around the 18th century. There were some survivors with some of the former beliefs. Now those are Sunni countries. It doesn't mean that they don't care about the river. They also have an environmental consciousness that is growing just like with our populations, but this is not, it doesn't have any mystical or religious dimension. And this mystical dimension, Alison, on the British coasts, could you witness it? Because there's a sea that swallows, that devours, that takes up space, and that could be personified as well.
Yes, I don't see it, people living there personifying the sea in the same kind of way. I see a kind of like almost an absence of meaning, that they have no connection to they might be connected to their land in that they're working in the space, or they're living in the space, they're raising their children in the space, but they don't have that connection. Even the fishermen don't really have that connection to the land and the place that we perhaps would have had in a more animistic worldview. And I feel that kind of quite deeply when I talk to people, that they don't, that they experience it on a certain level of kind of, it's hard to explain because the land was once all wetland, and it was a problem. It wasn't really a problem of too much water. There was a lot of water coming through, and in the end of the 17th century, they decided that they were going to drain it, that it was a problem. And this wasn't a problem for everybody. It was a problem for the people that owned the land, because they saw in the Netherlands how they were restructuring the landscape and draining it and making bog and swamp profitable. So the landowners had an interest to change that landscape, which would have been seen as quite mystical and spiritual, these places, these wetland places, and they changed it into something that was quite different. So, So the people that once lived there would have been, and there's a lot of burial sites that were discovered by an amateur archaeologist who spent 40 years digging over the area, and there are a lot of votive offerings at these wetland sites, and these kind of meres and bogs, because they were seen as thin places. They were seen as kind of like spaces between this world and perhaps an afterlife or some other world, some other experience. But I feel a kind of lack of that in East Yorkshire, not just in East Yorkshire. And it's also related to a kind of colonialism because there are a lot of languages in the British Isles that have been suppressed, just like languages all over the world. And like Irish, for instance, though it has much deeper relationship to the land and to other species and to kind of those experiences that are not material, that are more spiritual. And we don't really have that anymore in East Yorkshire, or so I saw kind of that as an absence rather than.
Tu écris dans ton livre.
In your book, in the excerpt that I could read, you also wonder about what it means to be human when the connection to nature and the earth is reduced or diminished. And to go in the same direction, we don't often talk about the link between the loss of habitat, the loss of biodiversity, and the loss of cultural symbolic heritage. And as you were saying, there is a direct link between the erosion of the coastline and the erosion, in a way, of the linguistic diversity. Some dialects are disappearing. Could you tell us a bit more about those intersecting stories?
Yes. When I'm looking for it in East Yorkshire, I have to look further afield because there is kind of like dialect still existing, but mostly it's kind of like gone. So I find it helpful to look at other stories and other places where languages exist in a more direct relationship with other species and with kind of like, for instance, so when we kind of like name something scientifically, it has just one role. It has to kind of like put it into an order, sort it out, fix it in place. When people name the species, places, each other in a more kind of like organic way, it reflects more of the embeddedness of the thing that's named and its relation to everything else. For instance, a lot of languages refer to clouds as rain houses, and that seems to me to be kind of a really interesting way to kind of look at that, because a cloud just doesn't really mean anything, but a rain house, it tells you the relationship to what to expect, where the rain's coming from, what the cloud is there for. It's just a simple example. So language, in a way, it carries culture and it carries meaning, and I think when a language develops in a habitat and among a people that have lived in a habitat for a very, very long time, then their connectedness is it kind of exists on lots of different levels, and it's hard to kind of like, once that starts to die, once a language is eroding, and linguists say that by the end of the 21st century there'll be another 3,000 languages disappeared. And it seemed interesting that it was eroding at a kind of a similar rate to the erosion of species. And yeah, I've lost my thread a little bit.
Cédric, toi, tu as aussi témoigné.
Cédric, you were also the witness of cultural erosion that was associated with the transformation of those territories. What is happening at the moment is that those republics became independent about 30 years ago, and they are rebuilding themselves with new borders drawn by the Bolsheviks. And they are renewing themselves with sometimes some nationalist fantasies. So things are moving, and there is also a return of Islam that is very strong. It changes depending on the countries or the regions, but things are changing, evolving a lot. It wasn't necessarily the focus of my investigation, but I can see it also at my own level. I started working in Central Asia about 15 years ago, and 15 years ago is not a long time, and I can already see the way some regions have changed. The vocabulary used and the words, the dialects spoken in those territories also evolved. Yes, Russian is still a lingua franca, the language that you can always use, but in Uzbekistan it's declining. And within those republics you also have different languages. Karakalpakstan, which is an autonomous republic within Uzbekistan, near the Aral Sea, they speak the Arakalpak, which is closer to Kazakh. In Uzbekistan, if you go to a city like Muhara, it's a city where you will hear Tajik languages or Farsi languages. So there are some subtleties in Central Asia. But those countries are just coming out of the Soviet period, and to talk about the relationship with water, there is also everything that remained due to the communist ideology. The relationship with nature in the USSR is a relation of power. It's a domination of human beings over nature. It's men taming nature rather than being victims of it. And that's why the idea was to turn the desert into a green area. It was about working the land as if we were God. So it is a form of chaos, and chaos, that's the perception, and the idea is that humans can try and shape the land the way they want. To continue in this direction, how do people in those regions name the river? Are there specific terms to refer to the Aral Sea? It is called Amudarya. Those are mainly peoples speaking Turcic languages, so this is linked to the traces of those languages. Formerly it was called Luxus. You also have elevation channels in Turkmenistan. For instance, the Karakum channel, which provides 95% of Turkmenistan's water. There are young people who never knew Turkmenistan in any other way than when it was provided with water by this river. And so this river is part of the geography that they know. This is the landscape that they grew up in and in which they work. The Aral Sea is now called Aral Kum. Kum means desert. So it's no longer a sea, it's just a desert. So some words are created due to the geography. The geography was reshaped by human beings. And so things are named according to what is seen. Yeah, let's talk about the importance of words. Alison, you say that when something disappears physically, this makes you want to remember it. A name holds something. It's a fixative against forgetting. On the 20th of April, we were with Bruno Pellegrino, a Swiss author, who said that the Swiss poet Gustave Roux urgently records the name of things that end. Alison, you also quote Annie Dillard, the US writer,
All
who
those things
says,
for which we have no words are lost. Toutes ces choses pour lesquelles nous n'avons pas de nom.
all those things for which we have no words are lost. Is this the role of writing, in your view, to provide physicality, materiality to those places that lose theirs? Is this the responsibility of writing, to name, to archive what is dying?
Yes, I think so. Yeah, I think, not just writers, but, in naming something, it kind of maintains it in the imagination and in the mind and on paper, and it fixes it, like a fixative against forgetting, like your quote. And yeah, and I think I try to think of it when I'm kind of like walking along the coastline, because I mean, we haven't got a map, but there's 5 miles of coastline gone since Roman times. So here along the kind of like eastern side, on the right, are all the lost places. Some of those places, things were rescued, like the bells from churches and church crosses and things like that. They've got like a physicality that kind of like can hold on to the memory a little bit, and they're kind of repositioned in other places. All the bells actually that I tried to go and see, I couldn't actually see them because the new churches that they've been moved into were in such a state of disrepair that I wasn't allowed ever into the tower to see the bells, but they're still there. Whereas most other places, the only thing that we have is the name. And in the same way that we name species and hold on to species, if we don't have those names and we don't have that record, then they're lost and gone. And you know, it matters. Words matter, language is matter, and yeah. So.
C'est vrai que j'ai des choses à rajouter sur cette puissance des mots.
About the power of words. In a context where things are destroyed, you tend to forget. Yes, what's also very particular with these the dramatic turns of events is the symbols, the symbolic characteristic that these places take on. The Aral Sea is considered as the Central Asian Chernobyl. It's a catastrophe that marks whole generations. It's almost appealing, despite the fact that it's not particularly beautiful. And there's tourism on the Aral Sea. There are places that people are ready to drive to for hours in their four-wheel drives to go and see an agonizing sea, to swim in a tiny little puddle, and the salt content is so high that it's like swimming in the Dead Sea. And then there are tourists going to Chernobyl. So it all depends on what you're interested in and the names you give. The Aral Sea is something quite powerful. I was particularly struck, I think it was in 2018, 2019, in the press. You probably saw the same headlines in Switzerland. People said the Aral Sea is saved, water is coming back, when in actual fact it's only the northern part. That's what you saw in the film. The Kazakhs decided to build a dam, contrary to the Uzbeks. They said we've got a river going to the Aral Sea, so it's only 5% of the initial surface, but at least the water level will go back up. Now, doing so, they've sentenced to death the 95% remaining, and it was only a short-term victory because the water level went up and then down again. And in the coming years, the Aral Sea will entirely vanish from the surface of the planet. It will be down to zero. I'd like to come back to the geopolitics of this. This is what we saw in the movie Beyond the Glacier, which ended with the fishermen saying that they'll continue fishing as long as there's water. And I guess the industry will continue using water as long as there's water remaining. And when we look at the geopolitical stakes, look at the crisis in France with the mega water reservoirs, it was very violent, but what's at stake is people's livelihoods. Can you tell us a little more about this? War. Yes, water war. The specialist didn't quite dare using this expression, but I know the Taliban in Afghanistan have a project. Yes, the Taliban in Afghanistan are actually digging a huge canal in northern Afghanistan around Mazar-e-Sharif, which is a very dry area, but great for farming. And they thought, well, all countries along the river did so why shouldn't we do it? So they're digging a huge canal, and we'll have to wait and see how much water they take from it. It'll probably be a major part of the Mudarria, and it's going to be hard for Karakalpakstan in the future. Turkmenistan is also concerned. It's a threat that's there. It exists. Now, the idea of conflict, I don't believe in open war around water. I think it's in everybody's interest to agree on things. Might be around a dam or a dike, but we're not talking about Ukraine. We're not talking about conflicts of this magnitude. There may be armed conflicts, but there are also lots of diplomatic efforts. People are flocking to Central Asia. People have started talking to Kabul. They're digging up this channel, this canal. Some countries are even trying to help Afghanistan. It's the case of Uzbekistan. They want to make sure that the canal that's being built will be built in the proper way to avoid the depletion of the water resource. So it has precipitated diplomatic efforts in the area. And there are conflicts around the quantity of water, but also around the seasonality of water. And that's the issue with dams. Countries upstream, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan have water, but they've got no energy. So they generate energy and power with dams. But in order to do so, they need to fill the dams in the summer when other countries need that same water. So they're all building a reservoir to anticipate on their water needs. Obviously, it exposes water to evaporation because these reservoirs are huge, but they're very shallow. It's very complicated. But in Central Asia, there's a kind of international organization. I engage with them. They realize what the issues are. I'm not convinced that there will be wars, full-drawn wars, but there have been displacements of population around the Aral Sea. There used to be much greater population groups as there is now. It's not like what you see in the movies with long queues of vehicles happening over a couple of days. It happens over the course of several years. There's no longer any water. There's no reason to stay there. And over 10 or 20 years, you realize that a lot of people have simply left. Now, I'd like us to speak about the youth, maybe to finish this talk. I know, Alison, you talk a lot about the youth. You were a teacher for 17 years. I seem to know. What about eco-anxiety or solastalgia that future readers may feel reading your investigations? You talk about the harsh reality unfolding, and for those of you who don't know the terms, eco-anxiety is the anxiety that you can feel because of what may happen or what is on the verge of being lost because of environmental transformation, whereas solastalgia is mourning for what has already been lost. So I think in both cases it's more solastalgia than eco-anxiety, but how can your work be used to respond to this concern? How can we go beyond eco-anxiety and solastalgia, and how can we give optimism?
Well, yeah, that's a very good question. And the way I kind of process it myself and try to kind of like convey positivity, because there are positive things. is looking at the conservation work that people are doing and the projects that are really, really making results, because there's a project, a water project, a wetland project to kind of like re-establish colonies of bitterns, which is a kind of water bird that was extinct in Britain. And they brought it back in the 90s, and it was almost extinct again because they weren't doing the right kind of like management of the wetland sites to, you know, to really support the recolonization of this bird. But now it's gone from like 11 birds to like 200, 300 breeding pairs, and that's a massive, massive success. And that's a kind of, you know, that's a beacon of hope, I think. And also, there's a kind of potential in nature in lots of places, like for abundance. The way that fish breed, you know, the thousands, you know, sometimes millions of eggs, frogs, insects. There's potential there for replenishment and you know, revigoration of populations, and that's a really important thing when we kind of like, you know, when we're projected to experience climate chaos, because healthy populations, they're more resilient and they're more able to kind of like respond and cope with acidification of the seas, or rising temperatures, or swamping of their environment. So there's a lot of positive things, and one of the interesting things working alongside the North Sea is that a lot of communities have kind of depended on fishing for centuries and centuries, and the whole community is based on fishing, and it started to kind of, in the middle of the 20th century, it started to decline. Fishing quotas, reduction in fish, decommissioning of boats, labour shortages, it all compounded, and all these places where fishing thrived have kind of like collapsed, and you see the kind of like effect on the communities. But there is a positive thing about the sea, in that during the Second World War there was they stopped fishing the North Sea, and you know, by the end of it the stocks were so plentiful that they could keep on draining it and draining it and draining it. It took them 10 years to deplete it again. So all that seems like you know, not a positive story. There's kind of like a positivity in that you know, it is possible, and that's what I hear from conservationists all the time, because they have to focus on the positive, and they're structured to...
Ce que j'ai l'impression aussi dans ton ouvrage,
I get the feeling that to go beyond this, to go beyond eco-anxiety, is you try to disconnect yourself from writing in the first person, to try and experience what we feel. You try and give us a sense of belonging to something wider than the first person, to embrace the landscape, its interactions, and that may help us go beyond individual anxiety because of all of this.
That's very, very interesting, and I've never thought of that before. I've never thought of like, though I do try to avoid the first-person narrative, I've never thought of it in terms of avoiding the eco-anxiety. I try to avoid the first-person narrative because I want to kind of represent a kind of collection of voices and a texture of the landscape to make it more meaningful, and to kind of represent more different voices and different layers of meaning in the landscape. And also I have the feeling that when I'm writing that I'm not kind of like, or that we're not, because I seem to be writing in we all the time, but we're not as kind of like, free-thinking individuals as we like to think we are, and that seems to be coming through more when I'm not using the first-person narrative. And I don't know if that's quite making sense, because it's not always making sense to me, but it feels important that, and it feels more authentic to divest the kind of, the I and that kind of narrative.
Cédric, est-ce que tu as quelques mots sur...
Cedric, maybe a few words very briefly before we move on to the last question. How can your work help us go beyond the anxiety due to all these issues? Well, I guess it's the time has come to reassure the audience. No, not necessarily, but you write about the harsh reality, and I guess your writing is there to give a sense of power, unless I'm mistaken. Well, good question, but there's also historic depth. We know that the global warming that we're experiencing is not the first such warming in the history of the planet. It's probably the most brutal one, and it's correlated to the Industrial Revolution, and therefore it's correlated to us. But there have been periods of global warming before. I discovered the Aral Sea, which is not a sea. By the way, it's a lake. It's a dip that is filled with water that cannot make it all the way to the ocean or to the sea. So this sea is there. It'll disappear, but it's not always been there. The Mudaria River used to go all the way to the Caspian Sea, and that wasn't so long ago. At the time when Genghis Khan got to Central Asia and destroyed all the villages, the Aral Sea did not exist. The river did not go all the way to the Aral Sea. There might have been a whole slew of little lakes, but the Aral Sea did not exist as such. I think it helps see things in a relative matter. Nature changes. Nature can be changed. It can be transformed. Obviously, we've got to be very sensitive in the way we deal with nature. So yes, it helps take a step back. And if I take a very tangible example, my relationship to nature, the emotions that I can feel, looking at things from a geological point of view, looking at things in the long run, makes you realize that we're nothing. We're a speck of dust. It's something that I try to do by going all the way to the source of the Amu Darya River. And I hope it'll be a success. I've got one last question that I'd like to ask you with a very brief answer, if possible. It's something that I tended to ask from all my guests in the series. If the Anthropocene heralds, at least etymologically speaking, the era of the human, do you think that nature and wilderness is dead? So, sorry, I haven't understood your question, says Cédric. Ask Alison to answer.
So, I think the wilderness is socially constructed, and we, our image of it, and whether we can ever experience nature that's not in a kind of like mediated way, I'm not sure, but I think if we are in the Anthropocene, then there'll be a point perhaps when wildness will come to its own, and post-human, yeah. Not sure what that will be called.
La question c'était de se dire.
So the question was, etymologically, the Anthropocene means the era of the human, so this could mean that this is the end of the era of nature. So do you believe that wilderness still exists, and if so, how? I heard that there are wolves over there. Wilderness. I know that it's a bit of a trendy word. I think that in order to have wilderness, there would be a need for such a great area. It couldn't be like the natural parks that we have in our countries. I may have seen it, wilderness in Siberia, in areas so vast that you don't even know in which country you are. I think the wilderness is where there are no flags anymore. It's so wild that there are no political issues about who is on which territory. I don't know. Maybe this is about demography. Demography has an impact on the destruction of nature. And it is not because we save more water or we pollute less that we will be able to compensate growing population. We hear that new planes consume 30% less fuel, but if traffic increases by 30%, we haven't made any gains. So at some point, the population levels will have to stabilize. We hear that it will be the case, but will it work in time? Won't we have destroyed everything by then? This is a very abstract question. I don't know if I answered well, but wilderness, if we're talking about demography and density of population, we don't live or occupy the land in an homogeneous way. Population is global, but if you go to Antarctica, miles away from the first city, you will still find traces of pollution. So there are still global phenomena that have the consequence that isolation is not necessarily a solution. You mentioned the wolves that are nearby. Yes, there are still some areas that are wild. What is wilderness to you? It's nature in its initial state. But once again, this nature, it's not eternal. It would evolve even without us. In Central Asia, if you look at the Islamic chronicles in the 9th, 10th century, there used to be equivalents of the Aral Sea with areas where Genghis Khan would go and hunt deers, and this disappeared before the Industrial Revolution in the USSR. So they are glaciation cycles, so maybe by now we have upended everything. It is possible, but one shouldn't think that everything is fixated and that we changed everything. So maybe the wilderness is permanent change. Maybe that's a good conclusion. I believe it's a perfect conclusion. Thank you both.